Hello and welcome to A Sense of Centerville in Washington Township, your place for stories about ordinary and extraordinary places and people in the Centerville and Washington Township area. I'm Susan from Centerville-Washington History, and I look forward to hearing your story. Today, my guest is Al Price. Al Price, a retired engineer, uses his hobby as a metal detector to find historical artifacts. Metal detecting has been an interest for over 20 years. He has created many educational display cases from his local finds, which he has donated to Centerville-Washington History, 23 and counting. He does extensive research to discover the significance of the artifacts. Beyond metal detecting, Al is also interested in researching the history of his family. Thank you, Al, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
All right, so I appreciate that Al is willing to do this and to share some of his cases and his stories. But beginning, can we talk first of all a little bit about how this interesting hobby developed for you?
It actually developed back in the 60s with my father, who had acquired a Heathkit metal detector. We put it together, and we went out to parks, things like that, and started trying to find coins and whatnot, but we wound up digging a lot of pop tabs instead. So that made the hobby pretty short-lived at that time. About 2001, my kids were older, and I decided to get back into the hobby, and I acquired a much better metal detector. And again, I started going to just playgrounds and things like that, just an hour here, an hour there, but I started developing the skills that way. Mm-hmm. In 2015, I had an opportunity to detect at the Greek Orthodox Church next to the Dayton Art Institute, because at one time that was a hill right after the Civil War where a lot of people came, and it was a park. And there had been a Tudor home there that had been demolished, but I had found among the things there what I believed to be a Confederate belt buckle from a carbine rifle. And that's where it took me about 3 months of research just to determine what it was. And that's how also the display cases started, because my wife had said to me, "Oh, don't put that in a closet, put it on display somehow." And that's how the idea of the display cases came about.
How cool. So our metal detecting equipment, is it expensive?
It can be. The one that I have now, I think ran about $1,000, but I know that there's more capable equipment now for less. Mm-hmm. And people, they can shop online, and then there is a store south of here that they can try them out and see how it is.
Yeah. So is there a lot of people that are doing this?
I think more than people believe. There's a club here around this part of Ohio called the Dayton Diggers. And I think at the time, there was about 30. And so you'd be surprised. You really would be surprised how many people. A lot of times when I go to ask for permission at a property, the owner will say, "Oh, somebody's already been here." And I'll say, "That's okay. Let me have a shot at it anyway." So you'd be surprised how many people are doing this.
Yeah, because it's like treasure hunting.
Yes.
Yes. So we'll get a little bit into that. Do you want to talk a little bit about your growing up years and your career?
My career lasted about 50 years. And I started delivering paper routes, mowing yards, the typical things you did in the 60s. In the 70s, I worked as a mechanic in the Army. I farmed. I think I've gotten up to about 35 occupations at this point. The last 25 years were spent at Wright-Patterson as an electrical engineer, initially at Wright Labs, which is now AFRL. And then I moved over to what is now NASIC, the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, where I did intelligence production there. So I retired 7 years ago, and that gives me time to do my metal detecting
Yeah, it's the second career you get to do all the fun. So you it sounds like you've done a ton of different things in your life.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, I have. I tell my granddaughter, who is currently attending Kent State, I said, I want you to be smarter than what I was because I worked a lot of odd jobs for years. I always worked, but it wasn't exactly high paying jobs, putting in hay, tobacco, other things, not high paying, but it was sure hard work.
You learned
So,
how to work hard.
right,
Yeah.
just not so smart.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it takes a little time to figure that out. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, and to learn how to do the things you need to do to get paid higher.
exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so how did you first become involved with Centerville-Washington history?
At the time, I had detected at Normandy Church, and I had donated a couple display cases to them of artifacts that I found up near the home, not the church. And Hilda Strange, who was on the board, asked me to give a presentation, which I did. And afterwards, she approached me and said, "Hey, I've got this little stone house down on East Alex Bell. You're welcome to come over there and metal detect." Well, don't have to ask me twice. I went over there and I did it and I found a few things which I offered to them. They said, no, no, that's okay. And so I approached Joellen Ullman, who had just become the curator.
Mhm.
And I said, hey, if I can find a few more things, I'd be willing to put a case together and just give it to you guys. And she says, that sounds great. And that's how it all began.
That is so cool. All right, so Hilda Strange is both on the Normandy board and also our board. And so now you've made 23 of these cases. And what you said was interesting that you always offer it to the person whose house it is first. Is that typical?
Well, that was the first time that was the first time again, normally I would go to parks. Like I had done Bill Yuck Park and I gave them some cases, but usually I approached the property owner first. And now that I've been doing this going on 8 years in Centerville, there's a lot of things I've already given in cases and duplicating things. It doesn't add to the story.
Mhm.
For example, there's a type of coin called a large cent, which I've given multiple large cents to Centerville-Washington history. Now I gave them one last year because I found it on the property where Spring Valley Academy is located today, but it had been the home or the farm of a Quaker by the name of Sears. In 1847, the year that the coin was minted, one of his oldest sons got married, so it was a time of joy and happiness, but his youngest daughter died. So it was significant to the family who lived there. So I thought that tells a story, not so much about the coin, but of the family.
Wow. So maybe we need to talk a little bit about the research. I think that's because it sounds like you do a ton of research. And first of all, how did you learn how to do the research? And take me through that process a little bit.
The research, that depends on the artifact, actually.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's just a no-brainer. It's
Mhm.
like you look at it, you're like, yep, that's a horseshoe. It's a special kind or a design or something, but you know what it is. And you can date it fairly quickly just by going online and looking at things. And sometimes it's a bit of a mystery. And there's a website that I often post pictures on in the description called TreasureNet. And there's people there that will help identify things from all around the world. They get on the website and they help identify things, and then I return the favor and help identify things for them. When I can't find the answer that way, then Dr. Green, who just retired from Wright State, I send him pictures. I belong to the Ohio History Connection, so sometimes I contact curators there. I go pretty far. So in the 8 years that I've been doing this in Centerville, there's only been 2 or 3 things that have just remained a total mystery to everyone that I ask.
Mhm.
So, but that's just the object, that's just the artifact. Then if you try to look at, okay, what about the family or the individual who might have worn that? That's very special. It's so rare that you can connect an artifact with a person that may have been passed away 100 years ago or more. And that requires a lot of genealogy research and looking at who was living on the property at the time and did they serve in the military, et cetera, which I'll get to an example of that in a little bit.
Take me through the process of the building of the cases. So you build these.
Actually, I purchased the case itself.
Okay.
But I have the artifacts, and normally at the end of the season, about November, early December timeframe, I sit down with the curator and I put everything out on a desk, along with some fact sheets, where I found it, what it is, approximately how old it is, and its significance to either local or national history. And then the curator and I will decide which ones that they want to keep for the historical society, and then we sit down and we start looking at things aesthetically, like these things would go well in one case and these into a different case. Okay, and so from that point I sit down with PowerPoint and I make some designs, 2 or 3 designs, and I email them to the curator and I let them choose. And they also do like some grammatical checks just to make sure that, factually my stories are correct, but maybe I'm missing a comma or something. So they took a look at that. And once everything works, I send the design down to Digital Fringe on 2nd Street in town, and they do the printout. And then I get the case and then the printout, and I put it all together. So
Wow.
That's how the case
Wow, that's a big process. Yeah, and we'll show a couple of these in just a minute. Okay, how about researching the properties that you metal detect? How do you go about that?
I always start with A Sense of Place, which is a Centerville-Washington history publication. It's been extraordinarily helpful, not only of homes and properties that still exist, but then a lot of the structures that appear even in the latest version of it have now been demolished for a subdivision, for example. So that's one of my go-to. I also look on aerial photographs. On the county engineer's website, there's an aerial photograph from 1938, one from 1949, and then from 2004. And I look at these to see what structures were there, what are no longer there, have roads changed? Where was the human activity going on in this place? So that's another thing that I rely on quite a bit. Also on the engineer's website, there are atlases from 1857, 1869, 1875, and 1896 of Montgomery County. And again, I'm able to see, who had the land at certain times. Mm-hmm. Okay. Deed research, family search. I go on and look at deeds, tax records. I mean, it just depends what I'm looking for and trying to get out of it.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. I mean, that's definitely something I enjoy, is to see how things have changed. But those are great tips for other people who are interested in their family history. That's how you learn where your people lived. So those are great tips. And then we talked a little bit about researching the items that you found from metal detecting. Do you have anything to add to that before we go on to your favorite artifacts?
I think with researching things, especially online research, you have to be very, very careful that a lot of times there's misinformation on the internet. And it's not because people are trying to fool us. No, it's not that people are trying to fool us, but what happens, especially with genealogical research, is that somebody will publish something or have a record on Ancestry or Family Search, and they think they've done due diligence, but then somebody else picks it up and it starts to
Proliferate.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And sometimes a person has to step back and say, oh, does this make sense? Can I actually walk through their sources, assuming they provided them, and does this make sense? And sometimes you find out that's not always the case. And then you have to write a journal and explain why.
Mhm. Yeah, it's true that the research is only as good as the researcher. And sometimes things like Family Search, you don't know who's doing the research if they know what they're doing at all. So I think that's why, taking a questioning look at the material and making sure that it's the documentation's from first sources and yeah,
As much as you
as
can, the
much as
further
possible.
back you go, it's more difficult. And the other caveat is if somebody is looking to get into, say, a lineage society, and DAR, SAR.
That's the Daughters of the American
Oh,
Revolution,
sorry,
Sons of
sorry.
the American Revolution. Yeah.
People are wanting that so much that they start with the conclusion and then work backwards with the facts, where you really do have to start with the facts and see, like, oh, does my ancestor apply to this or not? And that's something I've been running to with the Mayflower.
Mhm.
So
The Mayflower Society, is that
Yes.
one you are currently working toward, or?
One of my ancestors appears already in the Silver Book
Mhm.
for Francis Cook. However, the reasoning, they say probable.
Mhm.
And I looked at the reasons given, and I've disproved them all. So they put applications for him on hold.
Mhm.
It's who his parents are. And I've gotten a lot of flack for stepping back and saying, oh, we want to be in the society.
Yeah.
And I'm like, he fought in 3 wars, did a lot of community service, died poor, but he should be remembered correctly.
Mhm. Yeah. That's an interesting point is yes, we want those lineage societies, but if it's not accurate,
Right.
yeah.
And if we don't know,
Mhm.
we don't know.
Let's talk a little bit about the favorite artifacts that you've found, okay? So I don't know where you want to begin, but let me know if you need help.
Okay. Locally, one of my favorite artifacts out of probably the 170 that I've donated thus far is this simple Scoville button that was worn by Mr. Hatfield here. On the left, you see a picture of a young man in his Civil War uniform, his dress uniform. In the center is the Scoville button itself, along with 2 close-ups to show you the front and the back. And then on the right side is when he is an elderly statesman, and he actually owned the Archer home there on South Main.
Okay, and that's the one that's on for sale currently, and
But I found this button on Sheehan Road. There was a farm there.
Mhm.
And again, I went through old, aerial photographs. I went at old atlases, and I found where I thought the old home was. But I was wrong. And I had the fortune to meet a 102-year-old Pauline Silver. And she said, go up in the woods, find a slab of limestone that's 6 feet long, about 18 inches thick, and about 3 feet wide. And that's where you're going to find where the stone house was, because my father and I and 2 older brothers and uncle removed each stone and made a fence out of it, and we repurposed the stones in other places. And that had never been detected.
Wow.
And I filled 3 display cases because of that. Now, what's important about this particular find is I went through the census, the war records, and everything, along with when was this button manufactured. I'm highly confident that this young man wore this button. And I had found it in about a 2 foot by 2 foot area. I found about 6 buttons. So imagine a woman or somebody having a can of buttons and just spilling it on a dirt floor. And that's how it wears. And I found so many things there. But she was something else. When I first met her, I was invited into her home by her caregiver, and this was during COVID, so I had my mask on, and I came into the kitchen where Pauline was sitting, and I said, "Oh, hi, I'm Al, and this is what I'm doing." And I said, she said, "Can you take your mask off?" Of course, during COVID, you're like, but she said, "I survived the 1918 pandemic, and I'll survive this one." And so I called her from that point on my little firecracker, because she was the nicest person. But if you rubbed her the wrong way, she'd rear up on her hind legs,
Sure.
and right.
She deserves it. If you live that long, you can.
Yeah, so she was really something. And after I finished this case and the other 2 for the property, I did ask to see her again, and I took each of these to her home before donating them to the Centerville-Washington history. So sometimes it's just who you meet, like your next guest, Dr. Conair. I could really go on and on about things like that, but sometimes it's not just the artifact, it's making that human connection, whether the individual is long since passed or somebody who lived on the property afterwards. So,
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, is that, these artifacts remind you of the people, the stories that happened long ago. It's the same reason we collect, family heirlooms, is that they connect us to the past.
right.
Yeah.
And I remember I posted a picture of this on Family Search on his record, and one of his descendants in Southern Ohio contacted me about that. And I gave them a little more background in the description there at the top of the case. But that captures most of it.
Yeah. And those of you who are listening who don't know what Family Search is, because, if you're not a genealogist, you might not know, but it's a great place to do family history where you can collect records about your family, and other people share the documentation with it. And it's just a way to find out where you came from.
So the next case, this personally is probably the most important thing I found. I was doing some genealogical research on an ancestor, my first ancestor to Ohio. And this is the one that the Mayflower Society is having issue with. And I did as much research as I possibly could locally, but fortunately, he spent his last years in Adams County, Ohio. And so I traveled down there in 2020.
So this is one of your ancestors.
This is one of my ancestors.
All right.
And I did the research down there, and then I decided, it was in March, I decided to approach the farmer who owned this property. And I said, look, there was no deed for my ancestor. I know he appears in the history book down there as having had a mill along this creek. So what I did is I plotted all of the other tracts around him. So by a process of elimination, I figured out where he did live. And the farmer said, sure, go on down in the valley. Now just make sure you don't have any cell phone coverage down there. So if you break a leg, you're out of luck. I went in March because at that time, no rattlesnakes or copperheads would be out.
Yeah.
Right. So I went down there. The first day I just spent walking the property. The second day, I decided to get out a metal detector and start looking around. And of course, I found a lot of more modern things. The place that had been inhabited for a period of time after I believe he lived there. But everything else lined up. Even his daughter and son-in-law lived on the ridge right behind him. But what I did find there, the first thing I found was this really old chimney. And I took pictures of it here on the left. I took pictures of it and I showed it to Dr. Green. And he said to me,
From Wright State.
From Wright State,
Okay.
and he said to me that if my ancestor lived there prior to 1820, which he did, then that was his chimney, because that chimney was thrown up in one day. There was no mortar between the rocks. It was somebody just trying to get a roof over their head. So in the center, there's only one building left standing on the property, and it's a shed, and the planks are 17 this is the siding now, 17 inches wide, each plank, 4 inches thick, with wooden pegs coming out. And it had irregular saw marks. I showed him pictures of that, and he said that was cut by a 2-man saw. Okay, this was not gone through
a mill,
a commercial mill, right? And I thought, okay, this was probably repurposed from an earlier cabin. Okay, I've only seen one log cabin like that up close, and the logs were probably 15 or 16 inches wide. And then over here, there is a stone. I looked, nobody knows exactly where he's buried. According to the Daughters of America Revolution, he could be buried in any one of 3 cemeteries. So in this picture here, you have to imagine that there was lots of pieces of limestone in that area. But this one was odd because it was just kind of out there by itself, just about 100 feet from the chimney. So I took pictures of it. I thought, well, if he was poor, maybe somebody just buried him there. That was pretty common before 1820. And then down at the lower right, that's a ring that I found. I initially thought it was just off of a fork or something, like where, the blade goes in. However, I took a measurement of it because it's crushed. I took a piece of string and I wrapped it around, and if it was circular, it would be a size 10.5 man's ring. So I showed it to Dr. Green in person, and he said, yes, in the early 19th century, a lot of commoners had brass rings. Now, I can't prove, there's no initials inside or anything engraved, but it just stirs my imagination if it was his. So I leave it at that. I can't prove it, but it's just like, of all the things that I did find there, most, are later than him, that was the one thing that I found. So I thought I should dedicate a case to him, which is what this is.
Is this one you keep in your home?
Yes.
Yeah, because it's
right.
Your family.
Right.
Yeah.
So this ended my research on him while he was in Ohio. Prior to coming to Ohio, he had spent some time in Washington County, Pennsylvania after the Revolutionary War, where he served as a spy on the Ohio frontier. And then prior to that, he was in the militia during the French and Indian War, as well as the Revolutionary War. This is really important to me.
Yeah.
And again, it just stirs my imagination. Sometimes when you're researching and you're gone way down the rabbit hole and you just need to break away a little bit, and then I turn around and I see this on my bookshelf. So
it gives you motivation to keep
Sure.
researching. No, it's very special. Thank you for bringing that and for sharing the story along with it. Is being connected to those that have come before us. That's pretty special. Okay, so you mentioned you love being outdoors. Besides metal detecting, what other things do you like to do?
Well, if you attend the Americana Festival, I do volunteer there at the booth.
Yes.
And I get out in the crowd and I say, how would you like to win a gemstone? Of course, everybody's thinking diamonds and rubies, right? I said, all you got to do is answer a simple history question about the area. Okay. So I asked some simple question. They answer it, and I hand them a piece of flint, and their jaws drop open because they were thinking diamonds and rubies. But I say, a flint is Ohio's official gemstone. And it's a very important one because obviously arrowheads and all kinds of, Native American tools, but even early pioneers used it to strike a light. And think of flintlock rifles. Every piece that I hand out at the festival, I either find at one of the local parks or over at Morris Reserve. So that's one of the things that I do. If I'm not out detecting, sometimes I just like to hike and I'm looking down at the ground and I see a piece of flint. So I keep a little bag with me.
Yeah, to
So
get a little piece of flint.
That's one of the things. I love to sled ride.
Oh, do you?
I'm from Northern Ohio originally, where we used to get lots of snow. We had a 10-incher here a few weeks ago, but unfortunately I was ill.
Oh, you missed out.
Oh, I wanted to take my 6-year-old grandson for his first real outing. He's been with other people, but I said, until you've been with me, you ain't been sled riding.
Oh, yeah?
But, I've got a 6-year-old flexible flyer sled, and that thing's like greased lightning going down the hill.
Where do you go to?
Suicide Hill.
What's that?
Over in Kettering, the golf course over there.
Okay.
It's famous in this area for sled riding. But I would probably, for him, I'd maybe go over to the Kettering Rec Center. They have a nice little hill over there.
Not too steep. Yeah.
Right. So.
Well, that's a fun hobby.
And then fossil hunting. I just like, a lot of outdoor stuff. But again, with researching, as you know, genealogical researching, you can spend hours and hours on a computer or going through books. I mean, a lot of sit-down time as well.
Yeah, definitely. So you got to break up the time with some hikes and walks. Yeah. So what's next for you? What's in your future?
Interestingly enough, in early December, I donated the 5 cases for last season at the Nut Cottage. And on hand was Matt McCurry.
Now, who's that?
Okay, Matt is the son of Bonnie and Joe McCurry that owned Bonnybrook Farm on Clio and Spring Valley Roads. Okay. And he said to me, "Oh, did you know where the old well was?" And I said, "Yeah, there was one right behind where the home had stood originally." He said, "Yeah, but did you know that there was a second old well?" No. So on the 26th of December, he and his daughter met me at the property, and we drove back, and they spent about an hour looking for it, but eventually they did find it. It was covered up by fallen trees and different things, but they did find the well. And I had brought a second detector and let them kind of look around a little bit, but I said, there wouldn't be something like this way out here in the middle of nowhere without a cabin having been here or some structure. So I stayed there an additional 5 hours that day. And about 20 to 30 feet away, I found a pair of large cents and a flat button, all dating before 1830 in one hole. And I found pottery sherds that date to about the same period.
How can you date pottery?
This is something I met Dr. Green at Panera last week. There are websites, but he can almost just look at it and say, "Yep, that's Flow Blue," or "That's Transferware," and he's just a wealth of knowledge. So sometimes it's easier just to reach out and touch people.
Right.
But then 2 days later, on the 28th, I went back. And obviously I wasn't finding as much, but I found 3 additional large cents, and I found a coin minted in Lima, Peru, a silver coin in 1774.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, that was about 20 years before Dr. Hull and European settlers really started populating this area of Ohio. And I thought to myself, was the person who lived here originally a collector? Like, what's this doing here? So I posted it on TreasureNet. And what people said to me, or what one gentleman said, he said, up to about 1855, Americans used Spanish silver or silver from Spanish colonies because of the limited supply here in this country. And it was accepted as legal tender. Okay. Well, then it made sense to me, like why something that old could be found here. But I had to pinch myself the rest of the day, because when you find something like that, and it was the last pass I made over the property. So what's next for me? I am trying to keep going back, and the owner has been more than cooperative. It is private property, and they do have it, people going around making sure that it is. And it is going to be developed into Rookhaven by MI Homes, that property.
Mhm.
And I went to this Washington Township planning yesterday and got an actual layout of that. And the area I'm looking at is just on the cusp of one of the lots. So I'm going to go back as often as I can. And I approached Dr. Green. I said, hey, now that you're retired, I would love for you to come out there and do this right. Because I helped archaeologists in the past, but I'm not an archaeologist. And I said, for every metal thing I find with my detector, there's probably several non-metallic things in the ground, like those sherds. And I said, we've got a finite amount of time before they start bulldozing this area. And I said, I would love if you could help me, or if you knew a graduate student who could help me. Unfortunately, that's not going to happen. So I'm just going to do what I can while I can until, again, the construction begins. There's also the Updike property, if you're familiar with that, at the southwest corner of Alex Bell and Wilmington Pike. I've been trying to get out there for years. I'll keep trying. There's, the Archer home. I talked to Ed Ross, the president, about that. I keep my feelers out, but sometimes you just don't get the permissions. And I have to respect the owner's permission because I don't want to be shot.
Yeah, yeah. Or get in trouble, in other ways. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's not.
I mean, it's not worth it.
Yeah, it's not yours to take unless you have permission.
Right.
Yeah,
And then going back to a comment, do you know Alliston Dernball?
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. So I was doing their property last summer, and they're very interested in the history, and their youngest son, Jack, is as well. Well, a lot of the artifacts that I found there, I had found before and donated to the Historical Society, and they were so keen on the art. I actually gave them most of the things I had found, because they do take such an interest in the property. So especially when a property owner does show that much interest, I'm more than happy. I don't give them first right of refusal, but I certainly will share, because I don't keep stuff.
Yeah.
I usually do not keep, either that winds up in a case or I give it to the property. It's very rare that I keep something, because my wife and I have downsized twice.
Yeah, you don't need more stuff.
And we don't need more stuff.
Yeah.
So that real is going to be hard. That Spanish coin is going to be a hard one to.
Yeah. And it's also interesting because other people can enjoy, the story with finding it. Well, I know you brought one other artifact to show. Can you tell the story of that? And we can show it up here.
Well, this is a knife that I found as part of an archaeological team that was done by Ball State up in Indiana, as well as Dr. Green at Wright State. And he invited me to go out with his students, and they did a metal detecting survey of the woods there at George Rogers Clark Park. They're near Springfield. And that is where the Battle of Peckaway took place in 1780. And we had found buttons and different things. This I found near a creek bed, and as soon as I just started uncovering it, I actually got Dr. Green over to look at it. And he took it out of the ground very carefully and he put it in a Ziploc bag full of distilled water because it helps start pulling the alkalines out of the metal and starts to stabilize it. I looked at the report about this, and it's consistent with the type of knives that Kentuckians would have used during the Revolutionary War. So, can I say with 100% certainty that it was used during the battle? No, but all signs do point to that, and it's not my assessment. It's actually the archaeologist's assessment of this. So, this is another one of those finds from Southwest Ohio that I think would be probably in my top 5 overall.
Did you keep this one?
Oh, no.
No.
Oh, no. I mean, I was part of a team.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that you just, Dr. Green took it and they professionally
cared for it.
I mean, that's a whole process, doing electrolysis on it. Depending on the kind of metal, there's different preservation techniques. And I've learned some, but certainly not to the extent as far as cleaning and preserving it that they would do. Right. So there would be no way that I would keep a piece of history like that.
Because you don't know. Yeah, you don't know how
well,
to
it's
take
just,
it.
it's part of the bigger story.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for bringing those artifacts. So I know that you've spent so much time doing this, and I've really enjoyed looking at the cases since we have so many. We'll get them out every time we have an event, and people just love to look at them. So appreciate, first of all, putting them together and having that be a part of our history at Centerville-Washington History, and also for all of the volunteer work you do. You're definitely a great contributor, and I appreciate you taking the time to be here and sharing some of these stories. They've been fascinating for me, so I hope that they are of interest to the people listening today. And I'm going to go ahead and close to thank MBCC for helping to produce this podcast, and also to my guest, Al Price. If you have an interesting story about Centerville or Washington Township, please contact Centerville-Washington History. Please also come visit our museums in Uptown Centerville, Tuesday through Friday, 12 o'clock to 4 p.m. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and check out our upcoming events at CentervilleWashingtonHistory.org. Thank you. Bye-bye.